I'm not interested in looking backwards for the sake of looking backwards. I'm interested in looking backwards so that we can see a way ahead for the future. Nostalgia for its own sake is of no use in politics, but if you can learn lessons and you can apply them to the future, then I hope I can make a contribution to what comes next. As I said when I finished as Prime Minister in 2010, I was too old to be a comeback kid and I was too young to be an elder statesman. And over these last 7 years, I've been involved in the Scottish referendum, the European referendum, I've been doing work for the United Nations. And I think this is the right time, maybe 7 years on, to explain what you've been doing and how you saw the events of the time and what lessons you've learned, but also how I think the past shapes our future. I think the biggest challenge when you're writing is to discipline yourself, to be precise and concise. You can either sit down with a piece of paper and draw a blank, or you can sit down with a piece of paper and write thousands upon thousands upon thousands of words. And I think you've got to have the discipline to condense. You ask yourself what will interest the reader and not just what interests you. And you ask yourself, what am I telling people that is new, that is original, that is something they didn't know, as well as how am I summarizing the period in which we've lived? What does it mean when people say that in the 90s people felt better off when a Labour government came in? In 2010 they saw austerity and now they see it as something that has hurt them deeply. So I'm trying to explain the background to these events. Well, I think I wanted to start off as a footballer, and I spent my early years dreaming of being a professional footballer. Then when you're not a professional footballer, you dream of being a manager, then you dream of being the owner, and then you dream of about managing one of the national teams. So I was fascinated by sports. I was absolutely obsessed by playing sports, and I had these eye injuries while playing rugby, and it stopped everything dead. And all the things that I was once able to do, I was stopped from doing. And so it's actually been a very important part of my life, but I was never going to be a professional footballer. Well, one of the people that I met and admired and met later in his life after he came out of prison was Nelson Mandela. And I think it's very difficult to overlook the fact that he is probably the most influential person of our generation. What he achieved in releasing South Africa from apartheid, the courage he showed in foregoing his freedom for nearly 30 years in prison, and then the leadership of South Africa that came afterwards. So if there's one book that summarizes a lot of the challenges of building a more just society that has influenced me, I think it's Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, and I think it's one of the great books of our time. He was on a journey, and he used to say that if he had not been able to get rid of the bitterness that many people felt at the treatment that they had meted out to them as anti-apartheid activists, he would still have been in prison. He had to get rid of the bitterness if he was going to be a successful president, and he managed to do that. Well, I wrote a lot of books in the 1980s, 1990s, and before I was Prime Minister. I mean, I wrote about history. I wrote a book on courage, essays on courage to raise money for charity. I wrote about wartime courage. I did a number of books, and I found the only way I could do it was getting up 1 hour earlier a day and doing the hour's work before the works of the rest of the day started. And I found the best time to write is first thing in the morning, and I found that when I was doing this book too. And you know, you talk to writers, and some people say they write better late at night, and some people say that they write better, you know, in the afternoon. I think the only time I could write successfully is first thing in the morning, when ideas are fresh in your mind, and presumably, without realizing it, you've been mulling over the ideas in the night before. Yeah, I think Scotland can only win the World Cup if RAITH Rovers win the Premiership, because RAITH Rovers have some very good young players, and if they were finally recognised as Scotland material, then we might have a chance.